Let me tell you something strange about silence in the digital age, a phenomenon that has quietly taken root in the background of our hyper-connected lives. We live in a world where almost everything is shared, a culture that seems to demand a constant stream of broadcasts to validate existence. From the mundane details of birthdays and morning coffee cups to the grandeur of sunsets and even the intimate vulnerability of tears, laughter, and pain dressed up with filters, we are surrounded by a cacophony of digital noise. Yet amidst this relentless shouting for attention, some people choose to stay completely invisible. They are the ghosts of the machine. They scroll quietly, observing deeply, but rarely, if ever, do they post. You might know someone like that, a friend who sees everything but says nothing online. Or maybe you are someone like that. And the question that always lingers in people's minds, the question that baffles those who live their lives out loud, is simply, why? Why would someone choose to stay unseen when the whole world seems to be shouting for attention? It is incredibly easy to assume that people who don't post are simply shy, introverted, or perhaps just not tech savvy. But that is a superficial reading of a much more complex reality. It is not the full picture. Beneath the surface of that silence, there is an entire psychology at play, a deep current of thought that speaks volumes about human nature, self-perception, and a quiet rebellion against a culture that has become obsessed with visibility. For some people, this silence is not a void or an emptiness. It is a form of control. It is the exercise of the power to choose what the world doesn't get to know. Because whether we admit it or not, social media has subtly reshaped how we define ourselves, creating an environment that rewards display and praises noise above all else. Those who stay in the shadows, however, are often the ones who see everything most clearly. They watch without needing to interrupt the flow of content with their own. They think before reacting, and they analyze before judging. Psychologists have found something fascinating about this demographic. People who refrain from posting frequently often score higher on specific personality traits like self-restraint, introspection, and emotional independence. They tend to be less influenced by the dizzying highs and lows of social comparison and the desperate need for external validation. In other words, they aren't trying to prove who they are to an audience. They are trying to understand who they are for themselves. In a world drowning in performances, that level of self-possession is rare. We must be honest about the nature of our digital interactions. Most of what we post is not just communication, it is identity crafting. It is an unconscious audition for belonging, a way of signaling to the tribe that we matter. Every caption, every carefully selected photo, every status update is essentially saying, "This is who I am. Do you approve?" But when you stop posting, something fundamental shifts within your psyche. You begin to detach your worth from the fickle nature of digital applause. You stop thinking in captions and start experiencing moments for yourself again, instead of packaging them for a lens. That is the secret psychology behind many people who don't post. They crave authenticity in a space where everything feels staged. They don't hate social media. They just can't find themselves in it anymore. It is not about being anti-technology or anti-social. It is about refusing to reduce the complexity of their lives into highlights. When you have seen how easy it is to manipulate perception, to make a sad day look glamorous or a lonely moment look social, you start valuing what can't be posted: silence, depth, imperfection, and truth. For some, the decision not to post comes after a kind of emotional burnout. Maybe they once did share everything, documenting every meal and vacation, until one day it stopped feeling real. They realized that every time they shared something beautiful, they felt an invisible, crushing pressure to keep outdoing it. They weren't living anymore, they were performing. So they quit quietly. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic exit, just a slow disappearance from the feed. But here is what is often misunderstood about this disappearance. Not posting doesn't mean not feeling. It doesn't mean they don't care. It often means they care too much about presence, about meaning, and about protecting what is sacred. There is a concept in psychology called psychological ownership. It is the feeling that something belongs deeply to you, a thought, a memory, an experience. And when you post it, that sense of ownership fades just a little. The moment becomes shared property, open to judgment, misinterpretation, or even mockery. So people who don't post are often guarding their sense of ownership over life itself. They keep their moments untouchable, private, and pure. Maybe that isn't sadness or withdrawal. Maybe it is a quiet kind of freedom. Think about it. When was the last time you did something meaningful and didn't feel the urge to share it? When was the last time you laughed, cried, or achieved something and didn't immediately think of posting it online? That reflex, that need to display, is not natural. It is conditioned. It is the product of a decade of likes, shares, and dopamine loops, training our brains to equate validation with value. When someone steps outside that system, it can feel like rebellion, but it is also healing. They start rediscovering the simplicity of doing things for themselves again, cooking without photographing it, traveling without tagging it, feeling without explaining it. In that space, something awakens, a kind of self-awareness that doesn't need an audience. However, the psychology of silence is nuanced. Not everyone who doesn't post is doing it from a place of peace. Some are driven by fear. The fear of judgment, rejection, or being misunderstood can be paralyzing. Social media has amplified a subtle form of anxiety psychologists call self-presentational pressure. It is the constant awareness that you're being watched even when you're not, and for many that is exhausting. They worry that what they say might be misread, or worse, ignored, so they retreat, not because they don't want to connect, but because the cost of visibility feels too high. They want to be seen, but only truly seen, not superficially scanned. Ironically, sometimes the quietest people online have the loudest thoughts in their minds. They aren't absent, they are overflowing. They just choose stillness instead of spectacle. There is a deep philosophical undertone to that silence. In a world that constantly says, "Look at me," choosing invisibility becomes a form of self-definition. It is saying, "I exist beyond your perception." They might scroll through others' lives, nodding, smiling, or sometimes aching, but they rarely project their own lives because they understand something most don't. Not everything you experience is meant to be witnessed. Sometimes, the most profound things in life, growth, Grief, transformation happen quietly, unseen, and unposted. When you have lived through enough of those private transformations, you start realizing that being unseen is not the same as being insignificant. It is actually where identity is formed, not performed. This is where the paradox lies. Social media was designed to connect us, yet it often leaves people feeling more isolated than ever. When you don't post, you stop chasing digital closeness and start rebuilding real connections. You begin noticing who checks in on you without the need for updates, and you learn who remembers you without reminders. That kind of connection, raw, unbroadcasted, feels heavier, warmer, and infinitely more real. The people who don't post live in that space, they build relationships that don't need proof. They find comfort in the unshared moment, and they let life unfold without turning it into content. Part of this is also about identity security, knowing who you are even when nobody's watching. When you are comfortable in your own company, you don't need an audience to validate your worth. That isn't arrogance, it is peace. Ironically, the same people who don't post often have the most interesting stories to tell, but they save them for when you are sitting across the table, not across the screen, because real connection to them isn't measured in comments or likes. It is in shared silence, in eyes meeting, in laughter that doesn't need witnesses. These are the people who carry worlds within them, who process deeply, observe constantly, and understand quietly. They don't need the world to applaud their existence. They just need to live it. And maybe, just maybe, in a world so desperate to be seen, their silence isn't a flaw. It is a mirror, a reminder that not everything meaningful has to be shared. It reminds us that sometimes the most human thing you can do is to keep something entirely for yourself. You know what's fascinating? The longer someone stays off social media, the more they begin to see the world differently. Colors look richer, time feels slower, and conversations feel fuller. It is as if stepping away from the noise makes everything real again. Because when you stop performing, you start experiencing. There is a quiet beauty in walking through life without needing proof of every step. You aren't thinking about angles or lighting or captions. You are just there, fully alive, inside the moment instead of outside it. And that is something social media rarely lets us do anymore. But the psychology behind this goes deeper than preference or taste. It is rooted in how our brains process validation. Every time we post something online and it gets attention, likes, comments, hearts, our brain releases dopamine, the same chemical involved in reward and addiction. Over time, we begin to crave that validation, and we start thinking in terms of shareable experiences instead of real ones. Now imagine someone who resists that loop, someone who deliberately chooses to disconnect from the dopamine cycle. That isn't disinterest, that is discipline. It takes self-awareness to resist something designed to keep you hooked. People who don't post often have a strong internal locus of control, a psychological term meaning their sense of worth and happiness comes from within, not from external approval. They don't need the digital echo of "you're enough" to believe it. Studies show that people who take long breaks from posting or consuming social media content often experience a measurable increase in emotional stability and life satisfaction. Because when your sense of identity is no longer being constantly mirrored back to you, it becomes solid. It becomes real. You are no longer editing your life into something digestible. You are living it in all its messy, beautiful, unfiltered complexity. And maybe that is the real rebellion, to stay whole in a world that rewards fragments. But silence online doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes it hides exhaustion. For many, social media became a place where they once sought connection but ended up feeling drained. There is a subtle, emotional fatigue that comes from witnessing everyone's highlight reels while you are still trying to piece together your own behind the scenes. You start comparing even when you don't mean to, and you start questioning your worth even when you know better. Eventually, some people decide to step away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They realize they don't owe the world a performance, and they don't owe an explanation for their silence. They don't need to keep proving they are happy just to be believed. That is one of the quiet truths of this generation. We have confused visibility with value. We assume that to matter, we must be noticed. But real meaning doesn't need witnesses. Some of the most meaningful moments of your life, the ones that shape who you are, will happen without a single person watching. No cameras, no captions, no audience, just you. And maybe that is what those who don't post understand best. They know that privacy is not loneliness. It is intimacy with yourself, because when you stop broadcasting every thought, you start hearing your own again. You start reconnecting with the parts of you that got lost in the noise. Your quiet desires, your unspoken fears, your inner compass. That is something profoundly spiritual in today's world. It is not a withdrawal, it is a homecoming. Of course, it is not always peaceful. There are moments of doubt, of wondering if silence makes you invisible, if you are falling behind while everyone else is performing progress. But with time, you start noticing something beautiful. Your worth doesn't disappear when nobody is looking. It is still there, steady, like the hum of a quiet room after a storm. And maybe that is what real confidence looks like. Not the loud declaration of self online, but the calm assurance of self offline. Some people say, if you didn't post it, did it even happen? But the truth is, things that shape you most rarely make it to the feed. Your growth, your heartbreaks, your private victories, your quiet acts of kindness, they live in memory, not media. And maybe that is enough. When psychologists talk about authentic self-expression, they emphasize congruence, the alignment between who you are inside and who you show to the world. But in the age of filters, that alignment is constantly distorted. You begin to live as a version of yourself curated for approval. So when someone chooses not to post, it might be their way of staying congruent, of preserving that fragile truth between their inner and outer world. They don't need everyone to see what they are feeling to validate that it is real. They don't need to capture every sunset to remember how it felt. They live their life fully and quietly. And here is the paradox. Those who live quietly often feel life most intensely. They aren't distracted by the performance of it. They absorb details others miss, the way light changes on a wall, the pause before someone speaks, the sound of distant laughter. They are present, and presence is the rarest currency in a world built on attention. But sometimes, that very presence makes them misunderstood. People might label them as detached, mysterious, or even cold. Yet if you look closer, their silence isn't emptiness, it is depth. It is the calm that comes from no longer needing to explain yourself to be understood. There is a quiet confidence that comes from not needing to be known by everyone, just understood by a few. And that is what the people who don't post understand best. They know that not every truth is meant for the crowd, that some parts of you deserve to remain untouched by algorithms and opinions. Because once something becomes public, it stops being purely yours. It belongs to interpretation, to judgment, to trend. And maybe some moments are too sacred for that. So the next time you notice someone who never posts, don't assume they are hiding. Maybe they are just living. Maybe they found peace in the quiet corners of existence, the ones not lit by the blue glow of a screen. Maybe they are the ones who have remembered what the rest of us forgot, that being unseen doesn't mean being alone, that being quiet doesn't mean being empty, that sometimes the truest expression of who you are is silence, because in the end, we aren't meant to be performances, we are meant to be people, and the people who don't post, they remind us of that every quiet, unfiltered, beautifully invisible day.